Summer 1942. Hitler's armies sweep east, convinced that taking Stalingrad will break the Soviet Union and secure Nazi Germany's future. What began as a campaign for oil and glory becomes an urban slaughterhouse, one that will trap 250,000 German troops and shatter the illusion of invincibility. The Battle of Stalingrad didn't just redefine World War II, it spelled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. How did a city on the Volga become the graveyard of an empire? And what fatal decisions turned stunning success into total ruin? June 28, 1942. The German summer offensive, Case Blue, began with a thunder of engines and columns of dust rolling across the steppe. Army Group South surged forward, pushing east from Kursk toward the Don, with the 4th Panzer Army and the Hungarian Second Army leading the advance. In just 2 days, German spearheads covered more than 150 kilometers, overrunning scattered Soviet outposts and bypassing pockets of resistance left to be mopped up by following units. The open terrain and clear skies allowed for rapid movement, and by July 7th, the lead elements reached Voronezh, a city 300 kilometers from their starting positions, taken in only 9 days. The speed of the German advance stunned both Berlin and Moscow. Soviet commanders, facing the threat of encirclement, ordered tactical withdrawals rather than stand and fight. Whole divisions melted away into the endless grasslands, leaving behind burning supply dumps and sabotaged rail lines. The Wehrmacht pressed on, frustrated to find empty trenches and abandoned towns where they had expected to trap entire Soviet armies. Each day's progress seemed to promise another victory, and German communiques spoke of the Red Army's collapse and the road to the Volga opening ahead. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The rapid gains stretched supply lines thin, forcing fuel and ammunition convoys to race across exposed roads vulnerable to air attack and partisans. Panzer crews wrote home about the endless distances and the dust that clogged engines and lungs. The Red Army's retreat was not a rout, but a calculated trade. Space for time, land for lives. Soviet units regrouped east of the Don, digging in behind rivers and marshes, ready to fight on their own terms. By mid-July, the German High Command believed the main Soviet forces in the south had been destroyed or scattered. Orders arrived to split the advancing armies, sending one group south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the other east toward the Volga. The city of Stalingrad, once a secondary target, now loomed large as both a symbol and a strategic prize. For the men of the 6th Army, the horizon was filled with promise. One more push, and the Volga would be theirs. But the empty steppe hid more than just retreating soldiers. It concealed the first signs of a fight that would not be won by speed or surprise. July 15, 1942. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group South, was dismissed after warning Berlin that the rapid advance across the steppe had left his armies dangerously exposed. Von Bock's telegrams had pressed for a halt, arguing that Soviet forces still held strong positions along the Don and that the risk of encirclement grew with every kilometer. Hitler, convinced that Soviet resistance was broken and eager for a quick victory, saw caution as weakness. The order came down. Von Bock was out. 8 days later, Hitler issued Directive 45. The document, signed on July 23rd, split Army Group South in two. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields at Maikop and Baku. Army Group B, under General Maximilian von Weichs, would turn east toward the Volga. The city of Stalingrad, once a secondary objective, now stood as a prize equal to the oil itself. The map was redrawn with a single stroke, dividing men, machines, and supplies across two fronts separated by hundreds of kilometers. In this new structure, the German 6th Army received its orders: cross the Don, advance on Stalingrad, and secure the riverbank. General Friedrich Paulus, recently promoted and new to field command, now carried the weight of this mission. His staff background and methodical approach had earned him respect in Berlin, but he had never commanded an army in battle. Letters from headquarters in July spoke of optimism and confidence, with staff officers noting that the Russians are finished. But the division of forces left the flanks dangerously thin. Romanian and Hungarian units, short on anti-tank guns and heavy weapons, were assigned to hold vast stretches along the Don. Reports sent back to headquarters detailed long, exposed lines and requests for more support, a plea that went unanswered. The German Armored Reserve, the 22nd Panzer Division, was under strength and plagued by mechanical failures. Romanian divisions, stretched across nearly 140 kilometers, had only a handful of modern anti-tank guns per sector. Paulus and his staff pressed forward, trusting that speed and shock would keep the enemy off balance. The Sixth Army's advance toward Stalingrad gathered momentum, but the sense of foreboding grew among officers who understood the risks. In Berlin, Hitler's confidence hardened into inflexibility. Stalingrad and the oil fields would be taken at the same time, no matter the warnings. The fatal split was now set, and the armies rolled east and south, their fates no longer joined. August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe unleashed its heaviest assault yet on Stalingrad, sending more than 1,600 sorties over the city in a single day. German bombers dropped over 1,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries, igniting a firestorm that swept through the wooden suburbs and crowded tenements. Flames leapt from street to street, feeding on dry timbers and oil-soaked factories, while the smoke column rose more than 3 kilometers into the sky. The city's water mains ruptured or boiled away, leaving firefighters helpless as entire districts vanished in a single afternoon. Civilian casualties soared. Soviet reports from the first week estimated nearly 1,000 dead and over 1,000 wounded, but later accounts put the toll far higher, somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians killed in the opening bombardment. The city's hospitals overflowed with the injured, while survivors clawed through rubble in search of family members. The Volga, once a lifeline for commerce and evacuation, ran red with blood and debris. Those who tried to flee across the river found themselves targeted by German fighters or trapped by burning oil slicks. The bombing did not break the city's will. Instead, it transformed Stalingrad into a landscape of ruins, an environment that would soon favor the defenders. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to heaps of brick and twisted steel. The city's broad avenues became impassable, choked with rubble and burning vehicles. Yet within this devastation, new defensive positions took shape. The ruins offered cover for snipers and machine gun nests, while shattered factories and apartment blocks became natural fortresses. By nightfall, German advance units reached the outskirts of a city still burning from end to end. The road ahead, once mapped for armored thrusts and rapid infantry movement, now led into a maze of smoldering debris. The Luftwaffe's firestorm had turned Stalingrad into a graveyard for the living, but it also set the stage for a new kind of battle. One fought not for open ground, but for every cellar, stairwell, and shattered wall. The city's defenders, many of them civilians just hours before, began to dig in among the ruins, preparing for the brutal struggle to come. September 13, 1942. German infantry surged from the western edge and drove into the shattered heart of Stalingrad. The opening assault aimed for the central rail station and the Red October and Barricadi factories, names that would soon become synonymous with agony. What followed was not the war of movement these soldiers had trained for, but a grinding contest of inches. The city's ruins, still hot from the August firestorm, became a labyrinth where every block was a battlefield and every cellar a potential tomb. The fighting quickly acquired a new vocabulary: Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Squads advanced through sewers, basements, and holes blasted through walls. German grenadiers wrote home about clearing one room, only to find Soviet troops above them, or below, or hidden behind a pile of bricks. Soviet defenders under General Chuikov clung to the riverbank, using the debris for cover and launching counterattacks from the shadows. The distance between opposing lines shrank to less than the length of a city street, sometimes only the thickness of a single wall. Factories became fortresses. The tractor plant, the Red October steelworks, and the grain elevator turned into multi-story strongpoints, defended floor by floor, machine gun by machine gun. Soviet storm groups, 6 to 8 men at a time, slipped across the rubble at night, carrying grenades, knives, and submachine guns. Snipers waited in shattered attics and behind water tanks, their shots echoing through the ruins. The air smelled of burning oil and brick dust. Letters from the front described soldiers sleeping in cellars littered with the dead, waking to the sound of boots on the stairs above. German units reported casualties mounting by the hour. Platoons sent to clear a building often vanished, their positions retaken by Soviet counterattacks before reinforcements could arrive. The city's defenders used every advantage: broken glass, hidden stairwells, even improvised explosives. Soviet sappers tunneled beneath enemy strongpoints, setting charges to collapse entire buildings onto their occupants. By September's end, the Sixth Army's advance had slowed to a crawl. The promise of victory by speed and shock was lost in the endless struggle for stairwells, kitchens, and rooftops. The psychological toll was immediate. Diaries spoke of nerves fraying, of men unable to sleep for days on end. Supply lines buckled under the strain of constant combat. Ammunition and food ran low, and the wounded piled up in makeshift aid stations. For both armies, Stalingrad was no longer a city, but a maze of traps and ambushes, a place where survival depended on instinct and luck as much as training. The battle had become a test of endurance, and the cost in blood was only beginning to be counted. November 19, 1942. Before dawn, the sky along the Don River flickered with the flash of 3,500 Soviet guns. Artillery and mortars unleashed an 80-minute barrage, shattering the stillness across a front held by the Romanian Third Army. In the trenches, soldiers huddled under the pounding, outnumbered and outgunned. On paper, the Romanian Third Army under General Petre Dumitrescu fielded more than 150,000 men and 8 infantry divisions, stretched thin across 138 kilometers. Their anti-tank defenses, mostly 37mm and 47mm guns, were no match for the Soviet T-34s and KV tanks massing in the bridgeheads at Serafimovich and Kletskaya. Requests to eliminate these Soviet positions had been dismissed by German command, leaving the line exposed. As the barrage lifted, the Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army surged out of the fog. Romanian positions, already battered, began to unravel. Infantry companies broke under the weight of the assault, and the few reserves, like the 7th Cavalry and 15th Infantry Divisions, were too far behind to stem the tide. The German 48th Panzer Corps, including the 22nd Panzer Division and the Romanian 1st Armored Division, was under strength and ill-prepared. Of the division's tanks, many were obsolete or inoperable, and only a handful of German Panzer IIIs and IVs remained combat-ready. In some sectors, Romanian defenders faced Soviet tank formations with nothing but rifles and grenades. By midday, Soviet spearheads had punched through the front. The 1st Cavalry and 13th Infantry Divisions crumbled as Soviet armor and mechanized infantry swept past. Communications collapsed. Isolated battalions tried to hold out, but Soviet artillery and tanks rolled over their positions. In the chaos, Romanian officers radioed desperate messages for support, but the response was fragmented. The Romanian 1st Armored Division attempted a counterattack, but most of its tanks broke down or were destroyed by Soviet guns. The German 22nd Panzer Division, reduced to fewer than 40 operational tanks, could not halt the advance. To the south, the Romanian 4th Army, under General Constantinescu Claps, faced similar pressure. Here, the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies struck at dawn, overwhelming thin lines held by cavalry and infantry divisions with little anti-tank support. Over 75,000 men tried to hold a front too wide for their numbers. German reinforcements, motorized and infantry divisions, were scattered and slow to react. By evening, Soviet forces had broken through on both flanks. The Axis defense was in freefall, and the road to Kalach lay open. The collapse of the Romanian lines in a single day exposed the German 6th Army to encirclement, setting the stage for one of the greatest calamities of the war. November 23, 1942. The Soviet pincers met at Kalach, a small town on the Don River, west of Stalingrad. Soviet tank crews from the 4th and 26th Tank Corps shook hands on the bridge, closing the ring around the German 6th Army and its allies. The encirclement, known to the Germans as the Kessel, or Cauldron, was complete. Inside the pocket, more than 260,000 men, Germans, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, and support personnel, found themselves trapped in a pocket stretching 60 kilometers from north to south and 40 kilometers across at its widest point. The speed and scale of the operation stunned both sides. Soviet operational maps from the headquarters of Generals Vatutin and Rokossovsky showed the pincers converging with mathematical precision. The northern arm, launched from Serafimovich, had swept south and east, while the southern arm, crossing the Chir River, drove north to meet it. In just 4 days, Soviet forces had cut through overstretched Axis lines, shattered Romanian divisions, and bypassed isolated German strongpoints, leaving entire regiments behind as the jaws snapped shut. The numbers inside the pocket told their own story. 6th Army, under General Paulus, made up the corps, but the encirclement also swept up the 4th Panzer Army's left flank, 2 Romanian corps, and rear area support units, field hospitals, supply columns, construction battalions, and anti-aircraft crews. In the confusion, hundreds of vehicles and guns were abandoned or destroyed. The Luftwaffe's forward airfields at Pitomnik and Gumrak, now deep inside enemy lines, became the only hope for resupply or evacuation. Outside the ring, Soviet formations dug in, sealing every road and track with anti-tank guns and infantry. For the men inside, the reality of encirclement set in quickly. Radio messages from the pocket described growing shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition. Quartermasters reported that bread rations would have to be cut immediately. Commanders tried to organize a breakout to the southwest, but Hitler's order was clear: hold fast, no retreat. In Berlin, the news was received with disbelief. The largest German field army ever to take the field was now surrounded, cut off from all relief. Soviet soldiers celebrated the link-up at Kalach as a historic triumph. Official communiques boasted of the greatest encirclement since the start of the war. For Stalin and his generals, the Kessel at Stalingrad was more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of Soviet operational planning and the beginning of a new phase in the war. The Red Army had not only stopped the German advance, but had trapped the enemy in a steel ring, turning the tables on the Wehrmacht's own favorite tactic. The siege of Stalingrad had entered its next, desperate chapter. By late November, the air over Stalingrad filled with the heavy drone of engines, but the promise of salvation from above faded with each passing day. Inside the pocket, quartermasters calculated that the 6th Army needed at least 500 tons of supplies every 24 hours: food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, to stand any chance of holding out. The Luftwaffe's chief, Hermann Göring, had pledged that his transports could deliver it. In Berlin, the assurance was accepted. In the ruins, it was a fantasy. Reality set in with the first flights. The battered Ju-52s and pressed into service He-111 bombers managed, on average, just 117 tons per day, less than a quarter of what was required. Only 3 days during the entire siege saw deliveries approach, the minimum needed to keep the army alive. Most days, the airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak received far less, and by January, with snow choking runways and Soviet artillery closing in, the daily average dropped to as little as 60 or 80 tons. The gap between need and reality grew wider, with every sortie lost to flak, fog, or Soviet fighters. Bread rations, once 450 grams, fell to 225 grams by the end of November. By Christmas, soldiers received only 56 grams, 2 mouthfuls, barely 150 calories. Quartermasters issued orders to slaughter the remaining horses, hoping 200 grams of meat would stave off collapse. But the numbers could not be bent to will. Each day, the men burned more calories shivering in their foxholes than they could possibly consume. Starvation was not a risk. It was a certainty. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet, already stretched thin by demands from North Africa, was never up to the task. Of the 500 aircraft assigned, only a third could fly on any given day. Mechanical failures, ice, and exhaustion claimed more. On December 7th, the airlift peaked at just over 360 tons delivered, a fleeting high-water mark. Most days, the effort fell short, and as Soviet artillery zeroed in on the runways, the flow dwindled to a trickle. Ground crews, working in minus 30 degrees, struggled to unload supplies before the next incoming shell. Inside the pocket, discipline frayed. Letters from officers begged for permission to break out. Medical staff recorded cases of men collapsing from hunger and cold, unable to carry rifles or dig trenches. By New Year's, even the wounded could not be evacuated. The promise of Göring's air bridge had become a grim joke, bread reduced to crumbs, hope measured in ounces, and the sky above filled with the wrecks of lost planes. The Sixth Army was dissolving from within, not by enemy fire, but by arithmetic, starved by the numbers, abandoned by the empty roar of engines overhead. December 12, 1942. The German relief operation, codenamed Winter Storm, launched from Kotelnikovo with the 57th Panzer Corps leading the drive. General Hoth's tanks pushed north across the frozen steppe, aiming for the southern edge of the encirclement. The initial breakthrough scattered Soviet rifle divisions and advanced nearly 50 kilometers in just 5 days, raising hopes inside the pocket that rescue was finally at hand. Reports from the Sixth Army described a surge of expectation as distant artillery rumbled closer. Officers gathered around radios, waiting for the code word that would signal a breakout. But the reality outside the Kessel was grim. The 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, supported by the battered 17th, faced mounting Soviet resistance as they approached the Mishkova River. The Soviet Second Guards Army rushed in from reserve, dug in along the riverbanks, and brought the German advance to a halt. The 57th Panzer Corps, already under strength and short on fuel, could not force a crossing. Temperatures fell below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Tank engines froze overnight, and supply convoys lagged behind the spearhead, leaving forward units with little food or ammunition. Each day, the gap between Hoth's lead elements and the Stalingrad perimeter remained stuck at 40 kilometers. Inside the pocket, General Paulus received repeated signals from Manstein urging him to break out and link with the relief force. But Paulus, constrained by Hitler's order to hold fast and lacking fuel for a mass withdrawal, refused to risk a breakout. His staff calculated that the Sixth Army had only enough fuel for a single attempt, and without certainty of success, the risk of collapse seemed too great. Letters from officers described frustration and disbelief as the chance for escape slipped away. The men waited for orders that never came. On December 19th, after days of heavy fighting and mounting casualties, Hoth's panzer divisions reported they could advance no further. Soviet counterattacks intensified, and the Mishkova bridgeheads were abandoned. By December 23rd, Manstein ordered a withdrawal back to Kotelnikovo. The relief effort had come within sight of the pocket, but failed to break through. In the Kessel, hope faded. Supplies dwindled even further as the airlift faltered under worsening weather and Soviet artillery closed on the airfields. For the Sixth Army, the last real chance of rescue was gone. The fate of the encircled men was now sealed by a decision made far from the front, and the cold, empty steppe stretched between them and the world beyond. January 10th, 1943. The silence over the frozen steppe broke as more than 7,000 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire on the shrinking German perimeter. Operation Ring had begun. Artillery shells and Katyusha rockets hammered the western edge of the pocket, smashing trenches and setting supply dumps ablaze. The Soviet 65th, 21st, and 24th Armies advanced in dense formations, pushing against battered German lines, held together by men too weak to stand for roll call. In the north, General Rokossovsky's rifle divisions surged forward, overrunning outposts and forcing the defenders back building by building. The German 44th and 76th Infantry Divisions, already reduced to fragments, fell back toward Pitomnik Airfield, the last functioning runway inside the pocket. By January 16th, Pitomnik fell to Soviet infantry after a brief, savage fight, closing the main artery for supplies and evacuation. The airfield, once crowded with battered Ju-52s and desperate wounded, now lay under Soviet control. The few remaining Luftwaffe flights were forced to use Gumrak, a smaller strip already under direct artillery fire. Each day, the number of sorties dropped. Wounded men waited in endless lines for evacuation that would never come. Quartermasters reported that bread rations had fallen to 50 grams per day, 2 thin slices, not enough to keep a man alive. Horses had been slaughtered weeks earlier. Now, even the bones were gone. Soviet attacks pressed in from all sides. On January 21st, Gumrak Airfield was lost after a night assault by the 21st Army. The last transport plane lifted off under fire, leaving behind piles of supplies and hundreds of wounded. With both airfields gone, the only hope for resupply was airdrops, parachute canisters scattered blindly over the snow, many falling behind Soviet lines. For the men inside the pocket, the sky offered nothing but the distant drone of enemy bombers and the constant threat of shellfire. As Soviet units forced their way deeper into the city's ruins, the German perimeter contracted to a handful of districts and strongpoints. Supply columns vanished. Communications with Berlin became sporadic. By January 24th, the pocket split in two. In the south, Paulus and his staff huddled in the basement of the bombed-out Univermag department store, cut off from the northern group around the tractor factory. The last radio signals described chaos. Units without ammunition, officers begging for orders, entire battalions wiped out in a single barrage. Soviet tanks prowled the streets, their guns firing point-blank into cellars and bunkers. No relief force would come. No more planes would land. The encircled army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been reduced to scattered groups fighting for survival in the snow and rubble. In the darkness of the Stalingrad winter, the last defenses crumbled. Surrender was now only a matter of time. February 2, 1943. The last German resistance in Stalingrad ended. Over 90,000 soldiers, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and starving, emerged from cellars and bunkers to lay down their arms. Among them, were 24 generals and the Sixth Army's commander, Friedrich Paulus, now a prisoner of war. For most, the ordeal was only beginning. Soviet guards herded the survivors into columns, marching them east through the ruins and across the steppe. The journey to the camps was a sentence few would survive. Of the more than 100,000 Axis soldiers taken prisoner, Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, barely 6,000 would ever see home again. Disease, exposure, and exhaustion thinned their ranks day by day. Letters smuggled from the camps spoke of hunger and despair, of men trading watches for crusts of bread, of entire barracks succumbing to typhus before spring. The last German prisoners from Stalingrad did not return until 1955, more than a decade after the war's end. The scale of the defeat stunned the world. The myth of German invincibility, built since 1939, shattered in the snows of Stalingrad. News of the surrender rippled through Europe. Berlin fell silent, while Moscow erupted in celebration. For the first time, the Nazi regime faced the reality of total war and the possibility of defeat. Hitler's decision to promote Paulus to field marshal on January 30th, with the expectation that he would die rather than surrender, became a bitter symbol of the futility and fanaticism that had guided Germany's eastern campaign. Instead, Paulus chose captivity, telling his captors, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." The psychological consequences ran deep. In Germany, families waited for news that never came. The official lists of the missing grew longer with each passing month, while the regime struggled to explain how an entire army could vanish. Survivors who returned years later found a country changed beyond recognition, many greeted with suspicion or silence. In the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad became a rallying point. The city itself, once a thriving industrial hub, stood in ruins. Of the 75,000 civilians who endured the siege, only a fraction survived, their stories woven into the fabric of post-war memory. Stalingrad's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. The Wehrmacht's defeat marked the first time a German field army had been destroyed in its entirety. The loss of experienced officers and men could not be replaced, and the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed irreversibly to the Red Army. In the months that followed, German forces reeled from one retreat to the next, unable to recover from the blow dealt on the Volga. The battle's outcome signaled to the world that Nazi Germany could be beaten, and that the cost of its ambitions would be measured in entire armies lost and generations scarred. The fate of Stalingrad's prisoners stands as a stark reminder of the battle's true cost. Most would die in captivity, their names recorded in Soviet files and remembered only by families who never saw them again. The survivors, few in number, carried the memory of the pocket, the hunger, the cold, the silence after the guns ceased, back to a Germany forever changed. Stalingrad was not only a military turning point. It was a reckoning, a moment when the full price of conquest was paid in blood, and the path to Nazi Germany's downfall became clear to all who watched the frozen steppe. At Stalingrad, over 260,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped after the Soviet encirclement closed on November 23, 1942. Fewer than 6,000 of the more than 100,000 prisoners taken would ever return home. Documents from both German and Soviet archives confirm that Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout, combined with the failed Luftwaffe airlift and the breakdown of relief efforts, sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. The battle's brutality, evident in civilian casualty records and the letters of exhausted soldiers, shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked a clear turning point in World War II. Yet some details remain uncertain. Not all wartime correspondence between senior commanders has been released. and the full extent of civilian suffering is still being studied by historians. Today, the ruins of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, stand as evidence of the immense cost of total war. The facts remain. Stalingrad's defeat broke the momentum of Nazi Germany and changed the course of history.